Okay.
Welcome again, everyone, to the fifth episode of the Corona, uh, hosted by me, Omar Mohammed, a historian from Mosul and living my exile in France. Our guest speaker today is Ambassador Michel Rentenaar. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. He is a Netherlands diplomat. He is presently the Deputy Minister at NATO in Brussels. Before that, he was the Netherlands Government Climate Ambassador, and in 2009, he served in Afghanistan. Previously, he worked in the Middle East Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. And served at the Netherlands embassies in Egypt, Yemen, Lebanon, and the Palestine territories. He did 2 tours of duty in Iraq, where he served as the political advisor, Dutch battalion commander, as well as to head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Al-Muthanna this province in southern Iraq. Today we are going to discuss a topic that interests everyone in the world. It's the security and stability in a changing world. But before we start, I would like to highlight some points. If you don't like your face to appear in this video, please turn off your camera because we are recording. We will start talking for 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussions directly with Ambassador Rentenaar. Ambassador, before we start, we were discussing a very important question, I think, to everyone, that everyone is thinking. We are all talking about security, stability, etc. But to what extent do we have those 2 terms are still similar or relevant than or differs from the last 2 decades? It seems that every year there is a new challenge. Every year there is a new problem. There is a new crisis, whether in the Middle East, that is endless crisis in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, is still in Afghanistan, even after the deal between Taliban and the United States. We have problems emerging in Africa. We have the problem of the climate change. We have the problem of the migration. We have many problems. And the last one, it's Corona pandemic. How do you see the changing in the security and stability?
Thank you very much, Omar. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on your panel here tonight. It's a great honor. I'm very happy to be able to participate from my side here. Obviously, very happy to speak about this issue, stability and security in this changing world, a big title. But obviously, since I work at NATO, I will focus a little bit through that lens and see what has come our ways and how has it changed much. One little reminder at the beginning, perhaps, it's the usual thing to say, of course, even though I'm not planning to say any secret stuff or whatever, still, you know, a little bit of Chatham House rule would be appreciated, and to make this possible as an academic discussion amongst friends, let's say. So, stability and security in a changing world. Yes, well, if we look at NATO, let's face it, it is the largest political military alliance in the world. And since quite recently, actually, with the accession of North Macedonia, it has 30 allies. It's quite a big club. Started out, of course, with only 12 after the Second World War. And in fact, it was last year where we celebrated the 70th birthday of this organization in Washington, where we had the birthday party. And in fact, we celebrated it in the same room where the so-called Washington Treaty was made. And that Washington Treaty, of course, not expecting people to know it by heart, but some of it is quite well known. The most famous article, of course, is Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the essence of NATO. But so, to some others, also Article 3, that you have to pay for your own defense, and Article 4, that you should be able to discuss political and security challenges with the allies, are famous ones. And Article 10, which opened the door to new members. Consensus, that is the essence of this alliance. And that is at the same time its weakness and its strength. And I'll get back to that. It is incredibly difficult to get to consensus decisions on stability and security issues if you have to do it with 30 people around the table. Even a little bit more so now that I have to be 1.5 meters away from the next ally in a room. So you need a pretty big room to do that. Because of the corona rules. But it is at the same time, when its weakness, it takes a lot of time to come to decisions. It is also its strength. Because once this alliance has made the decision to go in a certain direction, it is extremely powerful. And it had to adapt, actually, as you already said in your introductions, quite a few times. 70 years is a long time. The first 40 years, of course, telling that to you as an historian sounds maybe a little strange, but they were semi-uneventful in the sense that it was the time of the Cold War. The world looked relatively simple. There was us and them. It was very binary. You had the NATO on one side, you had the Warsaw Pact on the other side, and everyone knew more or less what to expect from the others. And that lasted for almost 40 years until that wall in Berlin fell. And I would call that the first major reset for NATO in its history. Suddenly, the world looked very, very different. An open door policy, we didn't call it that at the time, but it was developed, and suddenly it was said, maybe all those other countries that we used to be enemies with, they should be part of our alliance. And they did gradually over time become members of the alliance. All of the former Warsaw Pact countries have joined. Even parts of what used to be the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, have actually joined. That was a massive change in history, not just to the alliance, but also to the global situation in total. And new concepts started to emerge, something like cooperative security. Should we have a relationship with countries like Iraq or Algeria or Libya or countries around us, let's say? And what should that look like? And should we have perhaps crisis management systems and mechanisms to deal with unrest or instability and insecurity around us? We didn't have that before. Then the second major reset was, of course, 9/11. Obviously, the first time in history, and until now, thank God, the only time in history when the famous Article 5 was actually invoked, and a complete reset of the alliance again, where we thought after the war things would be fine, more or less, we'll be friends with everyone. Suddenly it turned out we're not friends with everyone, and there are really big opponents. So the major second reset. Suddenly all those concepts like crisis management and cooperative security were again given a boost, but then much more in light of counterterrorism. Operations like in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, maritime operations in Somalia against pirates, etc. And then I think we had a little bit of a forewarning perhaps in 2008 with the situation in Georgia, Abkhazia, Ashken Valley, those kind of things. We saw already that perhaps Russia wasn't playing with the same set of rules, but the big game changer was 2014. The events in eastern Ukraine, and of course, the grabbing of Crimea. That changed everything for NATO. So that's the third major reset. And then if I look at that situation with much more testosterone, let's say, and deterrence, is more or less the situation we had until, I would say, February last. A situation that I often describe as Europe being somewhat of a fragile tent that we hope to keep together, but that tent is being threatened from rather powerful winds from all the four directions of the wind. Let me just run you through those. The eastern wind, as I said already, changed radically after the events in Ukraine. Suddenly things were not so nice anymore, and the relationship with Russia really started deteriorating in many, many fields. NATO started practicing closer to the Russian border and vice versa. The enhanced forward presence was set up in the Baltic states. More and more, we started drifting away from each other. The moments of dialogue were less and less. And what we developed was, as NATO and as allies, was what we call a dual track approach. So on the one hand, a strong fist of deterrence. Be careful, don't come closer to us because we will defend ourselves. But at the same time, the open hand of dialogue. A NATO-Russia Council is set up, and ways, let's say, to keep the lines of communication open. Not to mention the fact that especially in the last year, lots has been done to almost disassemble the arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation structures that we knew for decades in this world have been starting to disassemble. The newest one, of course, is the Open Skies Treaty, which is on the thread. Last year, the INF Treaty, and lots of stuff that some of us older people remember from Gorbachev and Reagan time, let's say, is suddenly under threat. So that's from the east, the cold wind, let's say. From the south, something that is not so new, but it's also been around for quite a while, is of course what's called, from a European perspective, the ring of instability. Lots of countries on the southern rim and southeastern rim of Europe, which have a problem with terrorism, but migration as well, weapon and people smuggling across the Mediterranean. But the question is very, very large question is what to do about that, and what can NATO actually do about that? You can't fight irregular migration with sending warships. You can't fight lone terrorists that end up on a boulevard in Nice or in the Bataclan in Paris or on a Christmas market in Berlin with NATO big military means. So it poses a challenge. It poses a big question. What can you actually do with that NATO when you really need it? And the security feeling, the stability feeling of people in the streets of Europe has changed because of terrorism. And then even the North, funny enough, has changed quite a bit. You mentioned climate change in your introduction. For 60 years, we used to think that the North Atlantic Ocean is somewhat of an inner sea for NATO between the US and Western Europe. And suddenly, since 2014, it's been possible for Chinese ships, for instance, and Russians, to sail across the northern part of our globe and to sail into that North Atlantic. That changed the security and the stability situation there quite a lot. And then finally, for the juicy political part, of course, the rather cold wind from the West. I don't have to alert anyone to the fact that there is now a different president in the White House, that he has somewhat of a remarkable leadership style. And that poses problems for all of us in the world. In fact, we as diplomats often feel that there are 4 different instructions coming out of Washington. One out of State Department, one out of the Pentagon, one out of the White House, and one out of Trump himself. And White House and Trump is sometimes not even the same. That's difficult to deal with. And the tone has changed quite a bit. You will have noticed that the Americans, and Trump especially, has beaten the drum very much that European nations should pay 2% of their gross national product on defense. This is something that we decided in 2014 already. But this American president takes us serious and says this needs to happen now. And for many European countries, that is very, very difficult to do. But in all fairness, it is not just the 2% that the Americans are asking for and others. It is also an increased readiness, abilities, military capabilities to be able to deal with those challenges, both from the east and from the southern ring around Europe. And that's only the normal stuff that NATO used to do already. So on top of that, we have gotten much more issues that are new, like cyber, emerging disruptive technologies, space, hybrid challenges. So the world has changed. And then I get to today. This was the situation more or less until February. And now the fourth major reset, let's say, that we had. We have at NATO a famous slogan: almost 1 billion people depend on NATO for their security. It's a slogan that is all around the building, and it's what describes NATO, let's say. But suddenly that's rather different. Suddenly that security has ended for many of us in lockdown at our front door, where our neighbor suddenly carries potentially deadly virus. And the biggest crisis since 1945, it's been called. There are many other apocalyptic terms being used about Corona, how it threatens our way of life. Many people ask the question, so what do I have NATO for? Can it help? Can it do something? Can it defend me? And the obvious answer is no, not necessarily. But it leads to very tough discussions amongst the allies. What can we do as an alliance? Is NATO a first responder? Yes or no? Is it not a national prerogative? Healthcare, should it not be multilateral at all? Many countries go through their own people first, let's say. So,
if you allow me, Mr. Ambassador, because something came to my mind now, is this a question of, can we depend on the NATO regarding the Corona crisis? But there is also something. I don't want to discuss the inside politics of NATO, but one of the biggest challenges to NATO itself is that one of its members, at least, is sometimes described or seen as violating the rules of the NATO. And I refer here to the challenges that the NATO is facing between in Turkey, Russia, Syria, and all of the situation here. How does the NATO see this kind of challenge and its relation to the security? And we have with us today, I think Bassam is here. I will unmute you in a few minutes, Bassam, because you would be better to speak about this. But I would like to hear your opinion first, Mr. Ambassador, regarding this kind of challenges that the NATO facing, not just from the global security, but also from NATO members.
Well, I wish it was unique to one ally, but I think allies have at some point been in that position where they were the only one. And that's actually probably also the beauty of the alliance. That sometimes if you're alone, that prevents you or protects you inside that consensus organization, whereby there have been huge differences of opinion, of course, between allies, but still the decisions taken in the alliance are taken on the basis of total consensus, and therefore everyone is protected from his own opinion. The relationship of the alliance as a totality with countries around it is something which is on daily on the desks and the negotiations desk and the table of the North Atlantic Council, let's say. That's not new, that's not of today, that has been throughout the 70 years. Many people would argue that the situation between Greece and Turkey in the 50s was sometimes extremely close to conflict. The fact that they were both in NATO protected them and allowed for some kind of discussion, political consultations to continue, even when the relationships were very difficult. And that's still true to today. Sometimes some allies, you are presently situated in Paris, so I'm sure you're very intimately aware of the French politics at the moment. And some of the things that President Macron comes with in the international fora are not exactly aligned with those of Trump or even of Angela Merkel. That doesn't stop these countries to have a meaningful dialogue in this alliance, because there are some common challenges. And those were the things I was mentioning that make it more important to sit together in the alliance than to break it up. But the problem is that Corona has changed the rules of the game a little bit. all of that was known until February. But suddenly this is a new thing. There are some things that will stay the same, definitely. The same kind of consultations, etc. That will all stay the same. But suddenly people are asking, is this the right focus? Are we not in an old-fashioned way focusing on things that did seem to matter or be the most important until February, but now is gradually changing? And I think some of those announced themselves already for a long time. The fact that cyber is a threat and that your world can be challenged through your own iPhone has been known for a long time. But if you look at Corona, the amount of disinformation and misinformation and false narratives that is coming our way is being poured over us in Facebook and everywhere. Some say our stability and security, as we know it, is actually changing in a sense that perhaps we should be better prepared for those kind of things. It's not just coming through bombs and bullets, but it's also coming through hybrid campaigns of misinformation to try to destabilize our societies, and through technical means like cyber and other emerging disruptive technologies. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what that will do to our stability and security in this changing world. And it will become more important if we get a huge bill, because we haven't spoken about the economic effects yet. If Corona will indeed tumble us in the biggest economic crisis that this planet has ever known, where are we going to pay that from? How are we going to focus on all those things that are coming our way that are going to be hugely costly? And we've made deals, amongst these 30 allies that we would pay 2% of our gross national products on defense. But people in the streets, average people, are asking, should I spend it on defense, or should I spend perhaps more on health, on being better prepared, on having better resilience against these threats?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the situation doesn't seem really optimistic. But on this note, how does the NATO see the Chinese question, if we can call it the Chinese question?
I don't know if there is a Chinese question as such, but I can tell you that NATO, in its 70-year history, until December last year, never mentioned the word China. The 5 letters CHINA never featured in any NATO public statement until that December summit in London. So that's only 4 or 5 months ago. And then for the first time, it was mentioned. And there's obviously a very strong correlation with the change of leadership in the White House. The present American president has made much more of an issue of the perhaps threats and at least the change of Chinese leadership in the world. And it is no secret, of course, if I say that amongst the 30 allies, there are at least 17 who have signed the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. More countries even have very, very significant economic ties with China. And in most countries, there are parts of the administration that work more on the economic benefits, so let's say the opportunity side. There are those in the Ministry of Defense, perhaps, that look, at least with a little bit of a weary eye, on the purchase by the Chinese of infrastructure in our countries. But there are also those who see an opportunity that say, well, basically without the Chinese, the world and the planet will not be able to combat climate change because it is already the biggest emitter of CO2 in the world. So it is a mixed bag of challenges and opportunities and something a little bit in the middle. And that's exactly where NATO stands. We have said, we will look into this. We need to understand first China better. And I think there's a lot to learn still, certainly in a multilateral context, in order to have a better engagement with China. And that's more or less where we stand.
Yeah, I think I would open the floor to.
Please do.
Yes, but first I would like to start with Bassam. I don't know if you are still here with us.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Bassam. How are you?
Deepak.
Is a former Syrian diplomat, currently based in the United States. I gave you the floor first because I think you have something to say. You are involved in this kind of studies of the security, and especially the Syrian question that is a major challenge to everyone in the world now.
That's very true. Thank you, and Ramadan Kareem. I believe the world is changing big time, and I believe that United States is becoming more and more far away from Europe. We in Syria and Iraq, I think we will become the new phase after Corona, more close to Europe. What's going on now in Syria is really disturbing when the Russians are using the refugees or IDPs as a weapons to destabilize Europe. And European looking at the Syrian crisis from different angles, from a humanitarian, more to keep these people away without trying to solve the core issue of the crisis in Syria. And that will take us to literally different kind of world the day after Corona. What kind of communication we will have between Russia, as for us as a Syrian, as very destabilizing factors in our region, how Russia will react to any European initiative towards Syria, and so on and so forth. And the ambassador was very clear at a very important point about the money. Who will sponsor, who will pay the money for European to improve their economy now? And accordingly, who will pay the money for reconstruction Syria, or Iraq, or West Bank, or Jordan? All these countries are not countries, they are failing states, but they are getting lifeline support from the international agencies. In the shortage of the money, what will happen to all that area, and how that will impact the European Union or the NATO, or the relation between that part of the world and Europe. And we back to China and Russia, I think they are really playing very destructive role. And the more Europe show its weakness or more busy inside its own life or home, clear home, they will try to fill the gap in a very destructive way. And I don't see how we can face that. I see more tragedies coming on, unfortunately, more failing states. The country that's supposed to be stable, Lebanon, till last year it's supposed to be stable, or the banks happen for the Middle East, now it's collapsing. Jordan, God knows what will happen. Again, Europe is very essential part for our geography. Even the US dominates by the media, by the militarily, the scene in the Middle East, but it's Europe, it's not the American. Thank you.
Thank you, Bassam. I don't know, Mr. Ambassador, if you have...
Can I react to that, please?
Absolutely, absolutely.
No, I think that's a very strong point. And in fact, even here, there is, I think, unfortunately, a Corona link. And I first have to start by agreeing on the sad and negative side. Indeed, the rather remarkable or failing leadership, let's say, by the US at the moment is always bad for the alliance. But in this case, even more so. It is sort of accelerating the end of what one could call the neo-colonial wars. And that's, of course, is everything that's happening in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, let's say. And it is even hastened by the Corona crisis, because quite a few allies have withdrawn troops from these countries, training troops, because of the Corona crisis, to keep these troops safe and to keep the numbers smaller. But it's unlikely that they're all going to return in the same numbers. So in a way, we might see an acceleration of that kind of, NATO at least, focus on the wars or the post-war situation in certainly Iraq and Afghanistan. However, and here I want to give it a positive spin as well, as Bassam was saying also, the Middle East is very much dependent on what's happening in Europe. Now, it can go two ways. Either Europe completely focuses on its own problems and starts looking very introvert and forget about the rest, or, and I think this is not unlikely, it is possible, very possible, that the somewhat sliding position of the United States, let's say, will open the political space for the European Union to take a much more robust posture towards its environment. And with environment, I mean the entire ring of instability around Europe. You see already that the present Commission presents itself, European Commission presents itself as a political commission that has plans, elaborate plans, also in terms of defense, crisis management, stability operations, training of police, training of counterterrorism forces, etc., etc. That didn't used to be so much until now. So also here, I think it's a mixed bag. Yes, there are many things to worry about, but there are also some small glimmers of hope that perhaps will guide us into a different kind of post-corona world.
Thank you. I would like to invite Melissa. I will unmute you. Sorry for calling you now without a notice. Melissa is a Deutsche Welle reporter, and I think she has important insights on this topic. Do you hear me, Melissa?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Well, what are you particularly interested in from the Chinese perspective?
I mean, I asked the ambassador about how does NATO see the China question, or if we can call it China's question. What's the place of NATO in China, or in the Chinese policy?
So it's really interesting because when I first moved to Berlin, one of the other fellows that came with me on the Bosch Fellowship in Germany was looking particularly at the case of China and why it wasn't discussed as much as NATO, at NATO, excuse me. And I'm really struck by what the ambassador has said, that it didn't appear as a talking point until December of late last year. And I am also struck by the ambassador's, I don't know if you want to defend yourself, but it seems like you are trying not to say one thing too much or the other in terms of taking a side in this US-China growing in that sort of spat. And I think that makes it very difficult for Europe. It's been very interesting to see Europe try to deal with the trade issues that the US and China are fighting over, for example, with Huawei. And but I do think that as far as NATO is concerned, since it is a security organization, that it strikes me as a little bit like ostriches sticking their heads in the sand in regards to China, if it was not discussed as a security issue until last year. There's demonstrable evidence that that cyber warfare is a big instrument for the Chinese, as it is for a lot of other major states. And so has there been any discussion from a security perspective vis-a-vis China? I know you said not until late last year, but even informally within the NATO mechanism.
I suppose that's a question to me, Omar.
Yes, yes.
All right, Melissa, nice to speak to you like this. No, like I said, it's a relatively new phenomenon. That is, on the one hand, you might say that it's really weird because obviously China has been around for a long, long time. But on the other hand, you also have to take into account that this organization wasn't formed for being a global organization. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So its focus is the so-called area of operation of the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, which basically runs from the east coast of the US to the most eastern allies. So in that sense, there was no security reason specifically to talk about actors much, much further away, i.e. on the other side of the globe. However, things have changed, and very much, as I already indicated, there is a different political climate, let's say, specifically in the United States, but not only in the United States. And I do apologize if I say a little bit of, this and a little bit of that, a little bit of apples and a little bit of pears. That is a professional problem. I'm a diplomat, and I hope you will understand that. But it's also because it happens to be true. We like the world to be black or white, but it unfortunately isn't. In every country of the NATO alliance, all the 30 countries, there are these different competing interests. There are parts of our industries who hugely benefit from their trade with China, and they don't want to miss out on these economic possibilities. 17, as I said, 17 of the 30 allies have actually signed the Belt and Road Initiative. They do that for very specific economic reasons, because they think they can benefit it from it and it will give them more income for their citizens. So that is a legitimate concern. However, there are also other, nobody's stupid in this world, let's say, in the sense that there's also known that, for instance, the harbor of Piraeus in Greece is already close to 100% in Chinese ownership. There are other examples of that where one can see that there are a certain amount of infrastructural investment, let's say, by Chinese, which should at least pose the question, why is this happening? Is that just for economic power of China, or is there more happening? You mentioned Huawei. I think that's an excellent example. Every single country of the alliance is going through that discussion, how to deal with 5G. Never mind these rather silly discussions that some people seem to think that 5G is like Corona or something, and they're burning these masts, radiation masts, let's say. But all these issues are relevant, and the debate simply hasn't fermented enough. It isn't clear. Can it be that 20, 30 years from now, we will think, oh, wow, maybe 2019 was the turning point. Then we finally, we first started seeing how it really is. And are we then in a completely different world, maybe a new bipolar world? I don't know. I can't, I don't have a crystal ball in that sense. What I can see is that it's definitely on almost every agenda in the European space, in the NATO space. The question is, what is China for us? And then there are, as I said, those who say, it's mostly an opportunity. There's those who say that's mostly a threat. And there is a middle group who says, well, it's a little bit of both. And that's where we are in the world.
Do you think that that NATO would benefit by having some kind of new organization or committee that looks at China, so that there is a better structure to deal with this topic that, as you say, is perhaps fairly new? As you explained, it hasn't been within NATO's geographic purview, so to speak. But the rise of China is something that has been going on for 20 years.
Sure.
And what really strikes me is that everyone seems very surprised by this the last 2 years, like they had no idea, they saw it coming. And I wonder whether you think it would benefit from having some more structure moving forward, and perhaps that would make things easier to talk about.
I don't think there's so much wrong with the committee structure at NATO. I mean, it's a clear pyramid, which is, it's basically, the organization is built by two pillars. There's a military pillar and a political pillar. And the political pillar has the North Atlantic Council as the top institute, and the deputies committee below that, and the operational, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole structure of things. And unfortunately, China isn't the one singular issue. There are super many sides of what's going on in China. And I wouldn't want it to be in one particular committee. I think it would be really not so clever to create a China committee, not to mention the fact that NATO doesn't have any committee that is focused on one issue only. The whole issue with China is that we need to better understand it. And that means we need to understand, how are they in cyber? We need to understand, how are they in their defense capacities, in their military capabilities, in their technological capabilities. And all of these issues are in different kind of committees. And together, these experts come up with what is eventually going to be somewhat of an answer of trying to understand China better, as we've done for decades with Russia and with many, many other countries around NATO. In that sense, it is not different, and it will eventually reach the political decks. But NATO is not more than basically the 30 allies themselves, how much they want to speak about this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for your insights. We have a question from Asa, who is attorney from the United States. Are you unmuted? Let me unmute you. I'm trying to unmute you, but you refuse to be unmuted. I don't know why. Okay, I will read his question if
I can see it.
yes, but you see his question.
That's the one starting. What's the role of Turkey in NATO, and is this likely to change? Right?
Exactly. Yes. He cannot talk because probably he is somewhere he can. Anyway, so this is his question. He's asking about the role of Turkey in NATO and what Turkish domestic and foreign policies and the relation to its membership to the NATO.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, Turkey has been an ally from almost the beginning, and obviously, Turkey is Turkey because of its position where it's situated, the geographical position. In fact, it would be really difficult to imagine a NATO without Turkey. It is a huge country at the southern belly of what used to be the Soviet Union and now Russia. It is the gateway, as it has been through millennia, between Europe and the Middle East. In that sense, it is super essential that it is inside NATO. Obviously, there are some times, and this is not a hugely shocking thing to say, but there are sometimes discussions about Turkish policy, bilateral policy to its neighbors or even internally. That, unfortunately, is also not new. It's not only Turkey that has that. We've had in the long history, the 70 years of NATO's existence, other countries that at least questions were raised about its democratic values, let's say. Need I remind people that Greece during the colonial regime was member of NATO, and so was Portugal. So this is also not totally new, and people sometimes focus only on today without looking at the historical sides of this. Sometimes Turkish foreign policy comes into NATO, definitely. One good example, of course, is the situation last year in Afrin and more recently in Idlib. And especially when Turkey's soldiers were attacked by Russian planes, and Turkey then demanded to have political consultations with its allies on what would be the ramifications of that. That is not an easy discussion, because the minute you talk about a country like Turkey, it becomes internal politics for many of the allies. That's true in France, that's true in my country, it's true in Germany, it's true in many countries. Obviously, you can't have a discussion only on the basis of what your parliamentarians are saying about these issues. So what happened to us as diplomats around that table is that we needed to focus on what was it that united us. And there were a few things that united us. One was the fact that there was a certain amount of solidarity at that moment, for the fact that Turkey had lost quite a significant amount of soldiers in that attack. Second, there was also a very much shared concern by the other 29 allies that indeed the role that Russia is taking in Syria, and has been taking for quite some time already, is something that should concern us, as Europeans. This is, well, it's not news, but obviously the Russian position, the way it has supported the regime in Syria, the involvement in the chemical gas attacks, etc., is of great concern to NATO. And therefore, eventually, we had to consult with each other. What does that mean? And one of the outcomes was that there's something called the tailored assurance measures for Turkey. This is something that has existed for some time already to help our ally Turkey to be safe on its borders, let's say, has been implemented already longer than before the crisis in Syria. And all allies were looking at possibilities to see if they could help out in that sense. However, that doesn't change the fact that in our national parliaments, there were big debates and strong ones, including in my own, with lots of criticism about Turkish role in Syria as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Isabel. Ask your question, Isabel, directly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you, Isabel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have read your question. If you,
yeah, if the problem is in the connection, I think you can see her question now.
Yeah, Isabel's question basically is, she's a historian and international relations student at Sciences Po and University of British Columbia in Canada. Canada, she says, has a huge, mostly unprotected land and maritime border in the Arctic, and she was wondering what plans NATO has to cooperate for Arctic patrol security as the Arctic become more accessible due to climate change. Would the Arctic be considered part of the North Atlantic? That's an interesting question, actually. Some of it, well, obviously the first part of it is totally yes. As I already said in my introduction as well, climate change has geographically changed our globe. I mean, it basically is now possible to sail around the northern part, where Willem Barents, a countryman of mine, got stuck on Nova Zembla 3 centuries ago. That's now no longer the case. So in that sense, yes, it is very, very true. The Arctic itself depends a little bit on your definition of the Arctic. As you said in the last part of your question, is that part of the North Atlantic, yes or no? Well, there's a somewhat long debate about that, whether that is technically exactly the same and where is then the border of the Arctic. Usually in military terms, it's called the UK gap, UK-Iceland gap. So basically you draw a line from the UK via Iceland, more or less towards your parts in Canada, and that's more or less the border of the Arctic. And the North Atlantic in that sense goes all the way down to the Mediterranean, more or less. But that's just for military planning purposes, that is really relevant. What is much more important is that you see an increased attention, political attention, for what's going on in these waters. The Russians have actually invested quite a lot in their what they call the Bastion concept. So that is their submarines, part of the nuclear even. Their fleet out of Murmansk is much, much larger than it used to be. So this is something that NATO looks at. And what is also very relevant for us is that we as humans in Europe depend much, much more on undersea water cables, for instance, for our communication. The fact that we can do this right now, this Zoom thing, has everything to do with these underwater sea cables. So we are, again, for our security, depending on lots of things that take place in the North Atlantic and including part of the Arctic as well. But there are open political questions. What's going to happen to the Arctic? As everyone knows, there is no land specifically on the North Pole, as opposed to the South Pole. So there is an open debate in the Arctic Council, to which my country is only an observer, but Canada is a member. An open debate about what should happen there. What will happen to the fuel resources that perhaps become available now that some of the ice has melted? What does that mean for the geopolitical relationship? Who is the boss? Where? And God forbid, what if it becomes more militarized, this area? Is that good or bad for the world? I think bad. So it's very much something which is on the agenda. We have also what's called a political military assessment of this North Atlantic and including parts of the Arctic as well. So we do very much look at that situation. I hope that answers your question, Isabel.
Thank you. We have a question from Christina, and I will read her question for the sake of keeping the baby quiet. My name is Christina. I don't know how to pronounce this Dutch name.
That's not Dutch. Like Josie Moore. That sounds very not Dutch.
I am a senior lecturer in the European Studies at the University of Amsterdam, specializing in nationalism studies. Her question is it perhaps China's hidden agenda to weaken the European Union by expanding its soft power in Eastern Europe? For example, Hungary, with its opening to the East policy and its own illiberal democracy. That's her question.
Thank you very much, Christina. I am an alumni of what you are studying. I used to study European studies at the University of Amsterdam, so I know what you're studying, and I sometimes still give lectures to the SES, which is the study society there at the European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Yeah, again, I mean, I said quite a few things about this already. Obviously, I cannot look into the Chinese heads in this sense, whether it's a hidden agenda to weaken the Union by expanding soft power in Eastern Europe. There are those who say that, definitely. You only have to listen to what's being said in the political debate. So definitely it is there. But yeah, that doesn't change the fact that as a multilateral organization like NATO, you have to focus on what is that you can really prove at the moment and perhaps be prepared for it. But defending, with a political military alliance to defend itself against soft power is not exactly the easiest thing to do. But yes, I've heard people say, it's not my personal, but I've heard people say that if NATO as a value alliance, an alliance of 30 countries that share a certain set of values, let's say, if that is based on our culture, on basically to get what binds us together in terms of Molière in France and Goethe Schiller in Germany and Yeats in the UK and Vondel perhaps in the Netherlands, does all of that cultural heritage bind us together enough? And in the end, will that bind us more, perhaps to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, than it will to Confucius and Tao? That's not for me to say. That's going to take much longer to trickle down. And the only thing we can do is keep watching it. And I hope that political scientists like yourself or European Studies will use their time also to really focus on that, because I think multilateral organizations can benefit a lot from what is happening in the academic world and the debates that is taking place there. It will form the discussions that we have at those diplomatic tables.
Yes, we have another question from Asa. I will read it for you. There is a lot of discussion about the role Africa will play in the coming decades. Africa is developing quicker now and a growing population. What are NATO's considerations of Africa's role regarding NATO and the global community?
Thank you, Asa. Yeah, very good one. There's a number of them. The African Union already is for about 10 or 15 years a partner organization of NATO. So NATO and the African Union are already cooperating on stability programs in a number of African countries. That is one. Secondly, as I said, NATO has developed for the last 20 years, certainly since 9/11, a very, very strong policy on the Ring of Instability. And that's, in the beginning, of course, was focused mostly on what's called the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region. But it has actually trickled down already quite a bit further. NATO, for instance, has Mauritania as a partner, with which we have quite significant cooperation programs. And now also, it's still in the beginning stages, but there is a discussion going on at NATO. What should NATO's role be in the Sahel, so further away from the traditional MENA region as we knew it, for sometimes obvious counterterrorism reasons, also for reasons of potential migration, which is a destabilizing effect if it takes place in a regular manner. But also there is an important link. And then finally, again, if I come back to the subject of today, there is even a corona link. UN OCHA has reached out to NATO this week, literally, if NATO could help in military transports to bring medical supplies, hospitals, etc., to a number of African countries. And that also is part of it. So it's not only the hardware side, let's say, fighting terrorism, etc., that NATO does, but it's also on this more soft humanitarian side, where perhaps some military capabilities, such as airlift capabilities, can help African countries. So I think the answer to your question is a full yes.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, we have 5 minutes if you would like to add more of your important insights, but we in somehow didn't talk about the challenge of terrorism, because we already have many problems going on, and one of them is corona and other things, but terrorism is also still a challenge, and it will remain a challenge to the NATO and to the world in general.
Yeah. No, I think it's good you mentioned that, because it is definitely one of the two major pillars of NATO's policy. One is, of course, Russia, but the other one is counterterrorism, definitely. Well, I said a few things about it. A, that it's not so easy to figure out what it is exactly that you can do against terrorism. One, of course, is an obvious one. Tackle it at the root, help those countries that are suffering from it very much, where there is a lot of homegrown terrorism, let's say. So there are support programs for Tunisia. There is a training program in Iraq to help fight Daesh. Obviously, the whole Afghanistan program itself was full anti-terrorism program, as it was in ISAF, when it was still ISAF, or now with the Resolute Support Mission. But more so, throughout all the partner countries, there is a counterterrorism component. Again, like I said, it's not so easy to determine exactly what it is that you can do as a large military machine. There's also political debate about it. Some countries feel that fighting terrorism is a national prerogative. France is clearly an example of those countries that doesn't want to deal with those issues too much in a multilateral context. But they also do see that there are multilateral sides to the problem of counterterrorism. What I just answered in response to Aza's question is also very much counterterrorism related. A lot of political analysis nowadays points to the situation where the caliphate, of course, has been defeated in Iraq and in Syria, but it's not gone. ISIS is not gone. But there is a black or an open spot in our political analysis, and that's the Sahel. In all those Sahelian countries, there are huge movements who are Daesh-like or Al-Qaeda-like organizations, and they have almost open reign there. And perhaps the next place where there will be a caliphate might be there. So what is it that we can do in terms of fighting it? And then again, that's what you invited me for. There is also a corona link to this. As I said, you know, some of the allies have reduced some of their troops in the counterterrorism operations, whether it's Resolute Support in Afghanistan or the NATO mission in Iraq. That has an effect. And that's an unfortunate effect, and it will take some time to get back up to speed. But there is also political debate going on. Donald Trump wants to be re-elected. 3 November is around the corner. He has made a very strong political promise that he will bring the troops home, as he says, and that has an effect. Who will take over that role? There are many unknowns in that. You see Operation Inherent Resolve, as the name of the fighting Daesh is called, is reducing its forces. What does that mean? Will NATO step up? Can we? Do allies have enough troops to fill the American slots? Will that be appreciated by the local populations of Iraq and Syria? Unknown. So there are many unknowns still, but it definitely is a debate that's coming our way and will probably hit us harder even after Corona crisis subdues a little bit.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for this very important and interesting talk. Thank you to everyone who attended. This is a small announcement for our next event. It's going to be on 21st of May. Our next speaker will be the former director of the CIA, General David Petraeus, and we will have direct updates from the governor of Mosul. The event will focus on Iraq, and the title will be Revisiting Iraq, the Land of the Two Rivers. We will announce this in the coming days, and thank you again for keeping your mic muted, and thank you everyone for the important questions. Many thanks to Bassam, Melissa, and the others. Thank you again, Mr. Ambassador, and see you next week. Stay safe, stay home, and please, please, please take more care of the elderly. They are our living memory, and they are our if we can say, the flowers of our life. Keep them safe. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Very good. Bye-bye.